we'll get rolling. We shall get started. You know, Sunday morning drivers are the weirdest drivers. I always, every time I get here, I always have something to think about. And I've kind of realized what it is. It's because there are simultaneously people who are like taking their grand old time to get to church and aren't in a rush to get anywhere. And then there are people that are annoyed by the people that aren't in a rush to get anywhere. I was watching that happen this morning. It's like, you've got a bunch of people that are just like, okay, I'm on my way to church, whatever. And then people that are just furious that everybody is driving.
Sunday morning drivers.
Everybody's driving at the speed limit. I watched a woman get so frustrated, she did an unsignaled U-turn in the middle of the road to take a different path. Hopefully, I don't know what she was doing, but she went. Anyways. Well, before we get into this, the new study, we're going to take about 10 minutes to talk shop. Because Paul and Andrea and I, and we're going to do 10 minutes today. We'll maybe do a longer presentation in one of the coming weeks after we get a chance to think about it and process it. But Paul and Andrea and I participated in the virtual Synod Assembly yesterday. So this is the benefit of a post-Zoom world, is that you can have a Synod Assembly which lasts from 9:30 to 3:30. Virtually, and you don't. Yeah, instead of the entire weekend, you don't have to drive to Eugene or Sun River or something like that. But just and Paul, feel free to chime in as well too. So Synod Assembly was yesterday. It was mainly business. There weren't any memorials or resolutions to vote on, which meant that it primarily, for those of you that have participated in Synod Assembly before, this might make sense. For those of you that haven't. Generally, what Synod Assembly is comprised of, and for those of you not attached to the ELCA at all, this might be a foreign language to you, but I'll try to translate as best as I can. So Synod Assembly is the annual Oregon Synod meeting of the Synod, basically. It happens once a year. It used to rotate between Portland, Sun River, and Eugene. It's hard. I know, it's so hard for me. But now, as of last year, we voted that it's going to be virtual 2 out of 3 years and in-person the third year. And I assume that third year is going to still rotate between those 3 locations. I don't know if we decided that.
I think those are the only locations that have been thought of as
possibilities.
Yeah.
It'd be fun to go to like Klamath Falls or something like that. Yeah. I don't know if Vern would support it.
No, Vern's would be great. We'd have to camp together.
Yeah, I know, right? So anyways, so we had our virtual one yesterday. Generally what Synod Assembly is about, well, a couple of things. There are worships that we do together as a synod. It's about the budget, just like any good church meeting, we talk money. And then generally there are maybe keynote addresses or workshops for attendees to participate in. But then it's memorials and resolutions. In other words, business that the church is passing, right? So like last year, one of the resolutions was a resolution to follow this current pattern of virtual 2 years and in-person 3rd year. So that was one that passed. I don't see Matt went into this morning, but they were our Synod Assembly reps last year and voted on that resolution. So there were no memorials or resolutions yesterday.
Just to give people an idea of the nature of a resolution, can be very controversial. The gun control resolution.
That was also last year.
Last year was extremely contentious, I think. And I wasn't there, but I know it's contentious between essentially the rural eastern and southern part of the state and the Willamette Valley, Portland part of the state, and we're just very polarized on that.
Well, and what was unfortunate about that one last year is that actually the resolution that took up the most oxygen was the resolution to move to virtual assembly. That one ended up having the most conversation, and unfortunately the gun control one was at the very tag end, which you have a hard time in it, and which that really affected conversation as well too, because people felt like they couldn't take the time to.
Right, and that's the thing about when you assemble in person, you can sit with lunch with somebody you don't know.
Yep.
And ask them, what do you guys think in Hermiston about this?
Can't do that virtually.
Yeah, I can't.
So there was none of that yesterday. We did hear the budget presentation, which was not nearly as doom and gloom as I thought it was going to be. It turns out that by and large, congregations in the Oregon Synod have held to their giving to Synod, with the exception of some few and some churches that are experiencing holy closure. But so the Synod budget was not all that contentious. It was not that different from last year, meaning that not a lot changes with expenditures. What was interesting was the bishop's keynote address. So she made an hour, had an hour essentially speech is the wrong word, but an hour presentation. And the tone of it was essentially, things are rough for our congregation.
So one indicator is a quarter of our congregations are looking for pastors.
Yeah.
That's a huge disruption in
Yeah. And there are multiple reasons behind this. One is there are less people coming out of our seminaries than there were. My seminary class of 2009 was one of the largest they'd had in 20 years. And it's only been downhill since. We were apparently the last gasp. I don't know. Also, so one of my friends actually was in the, I don't know if you saw the Luther video, but the woman who was speaking for the Luther seminary video was my friend Jenny, who is the campus pastor for Luther. I was very excited to see her as the spokesperson.
Jesse?
Yeah.
Do you think that the lack of students going into seminary is due to the fact that they don't see much hope for getting a good job?
D, all of the above.
But it's really expensive to go to
It
seminary.
Right.
is.
And what they don't see is the hope of ever paying off a loan.
Yeah.
For 4 years at seminary.
That was my question. Is there an average loan post-graduation number? Like, is it 60K that they're trying to pay off? Is it 80K?
That's a good question. I know how much my loans were when I came out.
Right, but you may not be, that's
Well,
2009,
but
and
yeah.
you may not be
No.
average.
Here's what I do know, is that when I graduated, I was on the lower end of the debt spectrum because I had worked a year, so I had savings and I had a 401k that I cashed in. So I was able to pay my first year of seminary without taking out loans. And then I took out loans every year after that. I mean, one of the tough things about going to seminary is there's very little financial aid available, right? It's a private institution, and so if you don't have a congregation that's directly funding your seminary, your seminary tuition, you just don't. There's not. I mean, you can get FAFSA, you can get federal student aid, right? But those are loans that get sold to the highest bidder as soon as you graduate.
On top of your undergrad.
Man, I paid off my student loans the same year I paid off my car payment for my black Mazda, which is now 10 years old. And so that tells you probably when I paid off my student loans. And my head was spinning by the number of times my loans got sold. And it was a pain in the butt because every time they got sold, you would have a new web portal that you would have to use to figure out what your current loan balance was. And I was always suspicious of whether or not they were just like tweaking my loan balance every time it got sold. Anyways, so yeah, student loans cost of seminary. So what I was going to say is that Jenny, being one of them, and her husband Colin both came out with 6 figures of debt. They had some debt from their undergrad that carried over, right? But then this is the thing: is if you go straight from undergrad into seminary, so you got one 4-year degree that's required in order to get another 4-year degree. You have 8 years where you're not earning income, right? You're just accruing student loan debt. And the average pastoral vacancy in the Midwest is about, when I graduated, your baseline pay was $38,000 plus housing allowance. I don't know that it's changed that much, actually.
At a 6-figure debt.
At a 6-figure debt, yeah, it's as bad as teachers in a lot of, worse in some ways. Yeah. So that's one of the factors. It's expensive, and a lot of people are looking at the prospect of not getting reimbursed significantly enough to justify that kind of
Well,
student
you
loan debt.
also, unlike a college student that goes for a degree in whatever, they usually have job offers before they get through their senior year.
Yeah.
With a pastor, you have to go through an internship, plus
Yep.
you have to wait to be called.
And some of those things are changing, right? So that's been one of the things that's been going on the last 5 years or so is an attempt by seminaries to streamline the MDiv process a little bit, because you're absolutely right. The third-year internship is a killer, especially for pastors that have families, right? So imagine this. Let's say you're going to seminary, your husband has a full-time job, but after 2 years of seminary, you have to pick up your whole family and move, losing your husband's job in the process. Or you spend a year away from your family, right? Or you restrict for your internship to find an internship locally where you're competing with 50 people for 5 spots, right? Because there are less congregations that have the money to be able to afford an intern as well too.
That's right. Just to flesh out the picture a little bit, we have only 4 candidates in
Yeah.
the Oregon Synod.
Yes.
And I think those are all pastor, no deacon.
Well, and to put numbers on this, there are 110 congregations in Oregon, 115, yeah. So rough math, that's around 30, 28-ish votes or 28-ish vacancies. Right. And we've only got 4 candidates from Oregon. So where are our pastors coming from? Not Oregon, right?
And so that also means that we're enforcing a system of displacement.
Yes. Right. Yep, absolutely. We are telling people that you need to go somewhere else. You can't stay. And to be fair to that as well too, that actually has been an encouraged strategy of the church for a long time, is that you were not encouraged to restrict to your home synod. You were encouraged to apply to other places. And again, you have marginal say in your first call. All right. So here's your reference point. I applied to you. So you fill out this is going off topic a little bit. That's okay. Here, we're gonna learn about seminary real quick. So when you graduate, Paul, I don't know if it was different when you graduated. When you graduate,
I just want to say I graduated in a sea of sons of Norwegian pastors.
Yes.
Surrounding me.
Yes.
And a few women.
PKs.
Yeah, PKs. And within about 5 years of graduation and being in Alaska, I was ready to write the book. I never did. Why my son will not be a Lutheran pastor.
Yeah, right.
It was so insular, so silent.
You should hear my dad's rant about this sometime. My dad, for a little bit of peek behind the curtain, my dad was a camp director in eastern Wisconsin. That's where my parents met. So he had to work with a lot of pastors. He was of the opinion that if you're the third kid in a row in a generation of pastors, you should find a new career. Do something else. Yeah, KPKs are worse than PKs, right? The kids of pastors' kids. Anyway, sorry. Yeah, so you graduated in a sea of Scandinavian
and they were
PKs.
Norwegian.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I was a Slav.
Yeah.
And there were just some things that I wasn't privy to.
Yeah, I know that feeling, man.
You were a Slav?
Despite.
I'm a Slovak by heritage.
Oh boy, that
Yeah.
must have been an interesting.
Yeah. Talk about cultural differences. Yeah. Yeah, and despite my 44% Scandinavian blood, I also found myself as an outsider, primarily because I came from a church which was largely disconnected from the Greater Synod, because we were small and rural, right? And so talk about culture shock.
Jesse, of that 25%, how much of that is retirements or people?
Well, here's another issue, okay? So here's what happens, right? Yes, I would say that almost all of these are due to retirements, okay? But here's another issue with this 25% vacancy number, then, is that pastors don't tend to retire from congregations that are typically first call congregations. So what I mean by that is that Generally, by the time they're reaching retirement age, pastors try to matriculate somewhere where they know that church is going to be around long enough for them to retire from it with with their healthy pension. I'm not being jaded here. I'm just kind of telling you where it's at. So what that means is that it's a church that's financially viable, which in the Oregon Synod is becoming an increasingly rare thing. Which means that congregation isn't necessarily going to want to take place on a first pastor. They're going to look for somebody with 5 years experience to use the cliche, which is tough, right? Which is tough for a first call pastor coming out with 6 figures of debt.
Catch-22.
It is. So one of the questions, one of the challenges now that the Synod is presented with is, okay, we have again 28-ish vacancies. With one of the other numbers that we heard, I don't remember if she gave numbers, but it was more of an anecdote where Bishop Lori said that every other week she gets a call from a congregation who's considering holy closure.
Which means they're closing down the church.
Yeah, which means they're considering closing the church. It's religious language. Yeah.
Obfuscate.
Which sorry. No, I already got some feedback from Paul. That's the preponderance of old and new religious language. How many times did you hear the word lean into things? Yeah, that's holy or sacred. Holy, sacred, and beloved. Those are the 3 words that get exchanged. Sorry, I can do a stand-up routine on this.
You are.
Yeah. So 28. So here's the big question: is how do we fill these vacancies, and or what do we end up doing? Which is, I think this is probably the way that the Synod is going, is looking to rope these congregations together into 2 and 3 point calls, right? Which isn't a bad idea. There's nothing wrong with that, right? That's been going on in rural U.S. for forever, right? But that's the way things are going. But then again, the issue is do you saddle a first call intern or first call pastor with 3 parishes of that? And let's be fair, doing a 2 and 3 point parish takes experience, because you have 3 congregations with distinct individual identities, with distinct problems, all of which in 2023 probably have a quite significant pastoral care burden to go with them as well too, right? So you wonder why we've only got 4 seminary candidates coming out of the Oregon Synod, right? So it's money, right? Money, student loan debts, and the lack of income. But it's also you are entering into a job world that has a lot of trauma attached to it, right? Because what tends to happen to institutions as they decline, right? To use a metaphor here, so let's say you've got a bucket of stuff. You've always got, as my supervisor in Indiana told me, every job has 20% crap. He didn't say crap, he used another holy crap. Holy crap. So, okay. And this is true of congregations as well. And I'm not saying that 20% of the people are crap. I'm saying that every congregation has a burden of trauma, right? And it's not just trauma, it's trauma and family issues and all of the stuff that, becomes your 20% crap as a pastor, right? The stuff that you work through.
Is that the counseling part?
Yeah, well, no, believe it or not, counseling is not crap. In fact, that, I'll be honest, is one of the more, joyful would be a strong word, but it's one of the more meaningful parts of what we do.
But dealing with family grief.
Dealing with family grief, but it's also, one of the realities of churches is that people don't feel inspired to come to church because their life is going so amazingly well, right? So folks tend to come to church because they got stuff to deal with, which is, to be fair, that's exactly where they should be going, right? I don't want to negate that at all. But here's what happens. So let's say you've got 20% and 80%. Okay. What happens as an institution declines is, guess what? You don't lose off the bottom, right? So as a church loses membership, who are the first people generally to leave?
Yeah.
Young, those who have other options in front of them, right? So you're losing off the top, right? But for those of you who are fans of math, right, what happens to your fractions as your total goes down, right? So this becomes 40-60, 50-50, right? So let's say, to finish this example up, let's say you're a young, well, maybe young, maybe you're a second career, first call pastor that's been gifted with a three-point parish of congregations who are in decline. 10 years ago, they were viable, now they're not, and they're all 50-50 churches, right? So how much crap is that pastor dealing with? 150%. Right? Okay. So yeah, I mean, this is another one of the things that another one of the quote unquote challenges. And sorry, I didn't intend to paint a bleak picture. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm just going to say that certainly the tone of the Synod Assembly is not bleak.
No, not at all.
And it celebrates many, many good things. But as Andrea and I agreed, our treasurer down by Mount Angel was by far the most clear, concrete farmer talker, because he hadn't been to seminary, I think. And really helped illuminate a lot of things clearly to all of us.
Yeah, but the problems with a good
Yes.
and
Yes.
he was by far the highlight of the whole thing.
He's a great dude.
Yeah. So, but what makes him so, in my estimation, is one thing. He clearly identifies as a lifelong Christian in community.
Yeah.
You know, it's an identity for him. It is not something where he'll come and go. He is there. It's his church.
Yeah.
And okay.
But he also was, I don't know, savvy sounds like not the right word, but also just visionary enough to realize you can't do things the way you've always done.
Yeah.
And he was able, he's like our age, and he was able to talk about we just need to find new ways of doing church. It doesn't have to look like the truck he bought in 1980.
Well, and I was going to say, to put a positive spin on this as well, too, a different way to look at this is that the Oregon Synod is on the front lines of what is the future of the Church of the United States of America, right? So we have this. I went to confirmation camp when I was in confirmation, and the theme for that summer was "Get to." So in other words, you don't have to, you get to.
Yeah.
You can imagine how well that went over with a bunch of teenagers. You don't have to wake up at 7 a.m. You get to. So what I was about to say is we don't have to be the front edge of the future of the church. We get to be the front edge of the future of the church. So, but this is what he was talking about in his budget presentation as well too. Is that a lot of what we're experiencing is actually experimentation, right? Is that we're as Paul and Andrew mentioned, we have already a long time ago realized that we can't do things the way that they used to be done. And what that means as well, and this is one of the struggles, by the way, between, like, for example, the Oregon Synod and Churchwide, is that a large majority of the ELCA still does things the way that they used to be done, right? And so there can be a lot of disconnect between, like, for example, Region 1, which is Oregon Synod all the way up to Alaska, and Region 2 in California and Hawaii. There can be a lot of disconnect between 1 and 2 and 3 through 9. Well, and that includes some of the East Coast as well too. Is that we don't want to do this necessarily, right? We're not doing this different because we're weird. We're doing it differently because we have to, right? We have to. We don't get to.
It's do or die.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
And there are a couple of, I think, wonderful things to look ahead at, and Carlos Puente.
Juan Carlos, yeah.
Presence is instructful for me in that he's, I think, potentially going to be very helpful to all of us to say, hey, who are we if we aren't in fellowship with people who don't look like us?
Yeah.
And that's a great question, and we need to look at that clearly. I think it's also a radical question for the Lutheran body as a whole, which it's had difficulty confronting that question forever. For instance, in about 1980, when I graduated from seminary, it seemed like the presiding bishop of the church said, "You know what? There are no more Norwegians coming on boats." It's 1980. You have to say that to people, right?
You know why? Because their quality of life is better. Why would they?
Why would they
We're give it 10 years, we'll be hopping on boats to go to Norway. Right?
I don't
Yeah, why wait 10 years? Yeah, they won't let us in. That's why.
So from there, then you get up to say around 2000, and if you just look at Oregon Synod, just the finances of the Synod were 2.5 times greater in today's dollars in 2000 than they are today. 58,000, I think, was our top number, so almost 60,000 Lutherans in Oregon. We're at 25,000 now on our rolls. So we're long past the day we should be talking about how do we engage with folks. So,
And that is a lot of what was talked about yesterday, right? Is ecumenical relationships, right? So as we lose capacity to do things as congregations, how do we partner with other congregations, other faith traditions to do things where we share a mission, right? So, a concrete example of this is like the Southeast Portland Youth Collective, right? Which is Debbie Stromberg, who's over at Creative Lutheran. So she and others formed a youth collective between 4 or 5 different churches are involved now, I think. And Creator is the only Lutheran one, right? So that's been going. So this is one aspect of this. It's cooperation between congregations in the ELCA as well too, right? So before you need to have one pastor for 3 churches, why not try having 3 churches with 3 pastors, work together, regardless, So, those things, but then also as Paul was pointing out, a lot of what we heard yesterday as well too, is that we need to start looking beyond our doors, right? Which, to be fair, I feel like we are not strangers to, right? It's not a new thing for us, but just kind of doubling down on that idea.
One of the things that I do appreciate of our denomination as well as several others is that it hasn't gone in the Bible college direction, which is more of a anti-intellectual, which sounds like a terrible way to say it, but has that kind of vibe in it. Are we looking to try and adopt some of that direction?
No.
Oh, good. Thank you.
No. And not at all. And sorry to point to what Jill's getting at. I don't know if I'm going to dip my toes entirely in. Well, because here's the temptation as well too, is that we're looking at the prospect of a declining institution. The temptation is to look at successful church institutions or perceived successful church institutions and say, what are they doing right that we're doing wrong? Okay. In the United States of America, the big difference between perceived successful institutions, by which I mean the churches you see on TV. Well, we can see our church on TV now too, so that doesn't apply anymore. But right, the ones where there's like 15,000 people in the stadium, right? Or in the Portland form of that, 5,000 people in a huge church that's right off the freeway, right? The major difference is theology, and that's just something that I personally am not willing to sacrifice. And it's not theology in terms of the theology that we read in Carl Brotman's book. Well, it is kind of too, but it's really social theology, right? So the things that we talked about yesterday were how and I'm going to mention this in the sermon, by the way, but okay, so we are institution that is experiencing decline. The question that is set in front of us is, how can we do the most good with the resources that we have available to us, right? And so the things that were talked about, especially from the church-wide representative that was there, is how Lutheran disaster response is continuing to respond to disasters, which is supported directly by ELCA congregations, right? That has not waned or waxed, right? That support has continued to be steady even in spite of our declining quote-unquote institution. Our synod is almost every congregation in our synod over the past 2 years has had some kind of class or conversation around race, right? That's pretty profound if you think about the average age of our institution. We have an entire section of our synod that is devoted to conversations around environment, ecology, and the climate, right? So it's asking the question, what do we do with the resources that are available to us, and how do we do the most good with those resources? That, for me, there's a stark contrast between that church and the church that says, how do we increase our resources year after year after year? How do we better our marketing team? How do we better our earned income statements, right? Without getting into the weeds too much on that, it's church as a business. Could we succeed as a business? I don't know that we can. I think it's maybe too late for that. But that temptation exists, right? Is to create a pipeline for pastors which reinforces a theological doctrine as opposed to encouraging people to understand this, amazing, unknowable God, right? It's to use the Bible college example, it's an institution that prides itself on public relations, but public relations as they apply to, media notoriety and not necessarily how well you know your houseless neighbors, right? Or the neighbors even that live near you that are struggling, or even just your neighbors, right? So yeah, right, there's that temptation does exist, no doubt about it. Especially when we see, to be fair, a lot of our kids who find themselves, and no shocker why. I mean, when you have 1,000 people, you can afford a lot of staffing, and that staffing tends to include a pretty robust, children, youth, and family program.
Well, that's how maybe our church as a whole is presenting itself. I get requests all the time from Lutheran Indian missionaries, and I get it from the Catholic Indian missionaries. I have to tell you, I give more money to the Catholics because of the way they present their requests and their need for kids. They've got kids' pictures, they've got quotes from these kids. It's just great. I can hardly wait to read the letter when I get it. When you get it from the Lutheran church, it's kind of like minutes from a meeting.
Oh, and you're pointing out something there, which is that all this being said, that doesn't mean there aren't things that we can improve at. Paul and I were actually chatting about that this morning, and he and I and Andrea need to have a further conversation on this as well too. But one of the things that we remarked on earlier is that the preponderance of specialized language that we continue to hear, and rather than getting rid of the old specialized language, we just invent new specialized language. Because I was thinking about that as I was sitting there listening, I'm like, if I asked my wife to come sit and listen to what's going on here, would she understand a single word of what was being said? And language barrier aside, the answer would still be no. We are bad at messaging because we don't know how to without using these terms, which in my mind don't really carry any water anymore. Yeah, we can do a lot of things better. So, anyways, I didn't intend for this conversation to take that long, but you know what? I mean, you guys deserve to know what's going on in our synod, and hopefully we'll have more opportunities to communicate this stuff to you, and hopefully we'll have opportunities for our synod to communicate this stuff to us as well too. That's one of our one of our takeaways additionally is that it would be nice to have a visit from somebody, and maybe we just need to ask more.
And Zim made a point of the fact that the Synod staff makes 300 contacts, 300 visits in the Synod every year.
Yeah.
And I know we have not had one for many years. And
We used to get surprise visits from Dave Brower Wiki all the time.
right, those are the dropping.
Yeah.
But you know what I'm saying? is
Yeah.
that we don't have a relationship strong enough right now for us to really understand how it is that we are. I mean, I just took it, okay, we're part of the same body of Christ.
Yeah.
Simple as that. Good enough for me. But not good enough for the majority.
Well, and you know, we were using that bucket thing as well too, is that I think also we're not a squeaky wheel.
Well, correct. Yeah.
You know, we maybe we should squeak more. But we haven't had really any crises to appeal to the Synod for. And I imagine that one of the things that they did, the Synod staff laid out exactly how many hours a week they have to do the increasing load of work that they have. And I imagine that unless we make an intentional effort to put ourselves in the attention of our Synod staff, since we're not right now at least, you know, experiencing any great crises, we're not in that 20% of the Synod.
So the last thing I want to bring up here is that we really have to figure out who it is that we want to engage in our cluster around us as we think ahead of how ministry should be done in our strain of the church.
And we've started to make, I mean, the fact that we've got a women's breakfast, you know, that has had one meeting, but another one. We never had that before.
Right.
We didn't do any of that pre-COVID, right? So, you know, more of that.
Right, yeah. But what I'm saying is we need to be intentional about
Yes.
it because you know, we've had this thought of a consultation is going to cost a lot of money for us as we think about how best to, you know, be stewards of this land and this property that we have. And one suggestion from yesterday on the screen was this bright young Indian woman say, yeah, if you want to give your land back to us, that's great.
That was great. But I thought it was contradictory then with the bishops asked that when you sell the land, you give half of it to the Synod.
Right.
Yeah. I thought those were some
They are
contradictory.
contradictory, but half of the gift back is zero.
Yeah, right, exactly. That's my point. All right, you know, like I said, I ended up going longer than I anticipated. That's okay. So let's spend the last 20 minutes getting into the weeds of the Book of Acts, right? So I mentioned on the church council call on Thursday, my book finally arrived. So I ordered a book on the history of the apostles. I just started leafing through it. I haven't read significantly yet. Looks interesting, no. But where we're going to start this study is the Luke Acts tradition, right? Because that's where this starts. So let's do a quick Jesus timeline, right? So we know what we're talking about. When was Jesus born? This is a trick question.
3 BC.
Yeah, 3 to 6 BCE. In fact, we used to go. Yeah, there we go. 4 BCE, right? There's our time. In fact, why should I draw it? Why don't we go over there? My cord doesn't reach that far. That's okay.
It wasn't December 25th as long as we, you know.
Yeah, no, it was not December 25th.
Unless it
So,
was.
so we're talking about the timeline of the church here. So Jesus is born somewhere in 4 BCE. The majority of the gospel narrative, well, I can point to it. You can see it. All right, I don't need to stand right next to it.
So the majority of our story, the gospel narrative, takes place in roughly a 3-year time period. How do we know that? Well, the Gospel of John, basically. There are 3 different Passovers that John refers to over the course of his gospel, indicating that maybe 3 years have passed during this. Other gospels don't give us quite so clear a timeline, so question mark next to that. But what we do know is that Jesus is crucified somewhere around 29 Common Era, 29 or 30 Common Era. Okay, so the dude only made it to 34, 35 before he kicked the bucket. Important dates: Council of Jerusalem,
which we're going to read about in Acts 15. That's in 49, so 20 years after Jesus' death. Council of Nicaea, we're fast forwarding quite a bit, is 325. And what's the significance of the Council of Nicaea? Well, who's the dude, right, that is around during the Council of Nicaea who saw an image from God just before an impending battle and had a prompt conversion, and he told all of his soldiers to paint crosses onto their shields? Constantine, yeah. The Council of Nicaea isn't necessarily a hard date because the Christianization of Rome in an official capacity does not happen overnight. Okay, it takes to the end of the 4th century Common Era. Okay, but traditionally we kind of point to that 325 date as the end of early Christianity, right? So that's where a significant change happens. So what we're kind of talking about is what happens between 29, the death of Jesus, all the way up to 325. Where I'm hoping to focus primarily is the 12 and or satellites of the 12, right? Because we could really cast a wide net here, and this would be a 5-year study instead of a 5 week to 5 month study. I don't know how long it's going to go. Okay. But what are the other timelines that are in there? When's Paul doing his thing about?
So late first century.
Not middle 1st century. And somebody asked last week, was Paul born when Jesus? Yes, Paul was an adult when Jesus was crucified. He was not.
Is Paul the apostle we're talking about, or is
Yes.
it
Paul, formerly known as Saul.
Dollar sign Paul. I like
Yeah,
it.
dollar sign. It was supposed to be S crossed out with a P, never mind, dollar sign Paul. Bling, bling Paul, right? There's a joke in there somewhere. Okay. So Paul, formerly known as Saul, was a Jewish authority, okay? He was a quote-unquote bad guy, according to the Christian story, right? He has a conversion experience. You guys, we'll read about this as well in the book of Acts. What's Paul's conversion experience? He's struck blind. On the road to Damascus, struck blind. And he has a vision, so then scales fall from his eyes. He has a vision of Christ. I'm paraphrasing. He says, why are you persecuting me, Paul? Right? He has a vision of Christ. He converts. What's interesting about Paul from the story aspect is that he's an outsider, right? So the book of Acts has almost kind of 2 tracks to it. One track is the path of the 12, right? Who are the VIPs in that track? Who do we hear about in Acts quite a bit? Who's one? Peter, yeah. Formerly known as? Yeah.
Dollar sign.
Yeah, dollar sign. So Pierre, yeah, Saint Pierre, the rock. Petra, this is one of our big people. We hear a lot about Peter in the book of Acts. Actually, Peter's story is one of my favorites because Peter's story is a conversion story. Both Peter and Paul's stories are conversion stories. I think that's fantastic. In fact, Philip's story. What's that?
He was a hothead, though.
Yeah, he did cut that one dude's ear off. Yeah, he was a bit of a hothead.
Well, he was argumentative with Jesus a lot.
Yeah, I respect that. I respect that. Peter, maybe Peter and Jacob share a lot in common. They like to struggle with the divine. But I talk a lot of trash about Peter, but I think he's a pretty good dude by and large. And his conversion story is actually really profound in the book of Acts. Who else? So I mentioned Philip. We get more than a snippet of Philip, but Philip's story is actually one of my favorites as well too, right? So Philip, right, the successful missionary, right?
Philip's story is he's converting thousands of people at a time, and he gets teleported by the Holy Spirit. You know, the Spirit beams him up and beams him down to southern Israel somewhere, where he encounters who? The Ethiopian eunuch. I don't need to read all this. You know, this is the problem, is having a whiteboard is a drug. I finally get to feel like all of my teachers and professors that I had for so long. And it's so much better than a chalkboard, too. So Philip has an encounter with the Ethiopian eunuch. Who are other characters from the book of Acts that we might read about? Who got stoned a couple weeks ago? Stephen. Poor guy. Was not... That's going to make me crazy. I was going to say was not great at dodgeball. Stephen got stoned. Stoning was actually extremely violent and awful thing to witness. But there's some history. Well, I think I have done my dissertation on stoning before in here. Because why was stoning used as a form of execution? Because you could throw it, number one, but everybody had to participate. Yeah. There was no executioner who carried the blood guilt of the killing. Who else? What about some women? Do we hear about some women? Tabitha, yeah. What about Lydia as well too? We have some unknown. Yeah, right. Here's the new accountant for the disciples, and thank goodness they had her. But we also get a lot of women who are unnamed. Ooh, did we hear another one?
Dorcas and Tabitha are the same book.
Yes, Dorcas and Tabitha are.
It is true.
It's but that's pretty cool though, right? Because we've got Simon Peter, Saul, Paul, and Dorcas and Tabitha. The women get to have two names too, right? I think that's pretty legit. No dollar sign. Well, Dorcas. the accountant, yeah. Well, Lydia was the accountant.
What about the Marys?
The Marys kind of disappear a little bit.
Well, yeah, like you think of Philip and Andrew, James and John. You know, it's big in the Gospels, and then where?
But let's talk about this real quick. So we listed all of these people that show up in the Acts narrative. You know who else? You know who's conspicuously absent from the Luke Acts narrative? Luke. Doesn't write himself into the story, which that's a different conversation. But who are the people we lose that we don't hear from again? The Marys. Matthew is conspicuously absent.
So after the lot fell on Matthias, where did he go?
Yeah, what happens to Matthias after he wins the coin flip? Yeah. Nothing, apparently. Who's the other dude? Who was the other dude in the coin flip? It started with B.
Bartholomew.
Was it Bartholomew? No, Bartholomew wasn't.
Joseph called Barsabbas.
Barsabbas. Yeah. Barsabbas. What isn't that the other? Whatever. Okay. So the Marys, but who are like Marys? Mary, mother of Jesus, not in the narrative, really. Mary Magdalene, conspicuously absent from the Acts narrative. The first evangelist, right? The woman who proclaims the good news of Jesus' resurrection to the disciples. Mary and Martha, Lazarus, right? What happens to all these folks? We will never find out. I mean, this is really one of the unfortunate things is we don't know. An interesting question to ask about that is why? Why? Well, as we study the lives of the apostles, one of the things we have to talk about are our sources. Okay? So what are our sources? Scripture, right? Primarily, what we have are the Luke Acts narrative. This tells us stories. Paul's letters, epistles and other epistles, right? The letters of Peter, the letters of John, Hebrews not really. John's Revelation, by the way, a different John from the other John and the other John. But John's Revelation doesn't talk about anybody in particular either. It talks about churches, right? The 7 churches in Asia Minor, as opposed to Asia Major. As a kid, this is going to sound silly. I conflated Asia Minor with Ursa Minor. For whatever reason, I imagined the 7 churches in Asia to make up a bear. That was, I don't know, my brain works funny. But what other sources are we going to be working with? There are, yeah. So he's it. Yeah. So we have historians that are around during that time, and the big numero uno is a guy named Josephus. We're going to talk a little bit about Josephus next week, maybe next week.
Do any of the church fathers have some back history, like Tertullian or those guys?
Yes. Okay. So under historians, okay, we have Josephus. But when we're talking about history, and in maybe a scholarly venue, you talk about primary sources, right, and secondary sources. The same is going to be true of this. Okay, so Josephus is kind of our only primary source. And what I mean by that is Josephus is the only one who is contemporary to this time period. Okay, I don't remember because I can look it up real quick when I'm talking when he lived and died. But he's the only one that we have around. But what we do get as well is we get anecdotal stuff from people after the fact. So we talked about Constantine, right? Another important person in that realm is my wife's namesake, Helena, or Helen, or if you're French, Hélène, who is the mother of Constantine. One of the things that Saint Hélène does is she goes and tries to figure out where all those places were, right? So Christianity is becoming a thing. Well, it's been a thing, but it's becoming a really Roman thing. And so Helena, is really curious about where all of these things happen. So, for example, where is the place of the nativity? Where is Jesus born? Where did Jesus grow up? Where was Jesus crucified? Because believe it or not, a lot changes in 300 years, archaeologically and geographically. So she, interestingly enough, goes back and does some research of her own, right? Now, granted, how do I say it? Remember when I went to Israel and I came back and I did a slideshow and I showed you a bunch of cool things like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and I always included an unspoken asterisk, which is, this is where we traditionally hold Jesus to have been crucified. Yeah, and that's exactly it. Is that she did some research, and I don't mean to again, this is 3rd, 4th century common era. She did some research based off of the sources that were available to her, and she said, this is the spot, and this is the spot. Okay. So a lot of our holy sites are St. Helen's best guess, essentially. But so I was talking about secondary sources, right? So the early church leadership, right? They do have some stuff to say about what happened with their predecessors, because by the time we get to 4th century Common Era, what the church leadership looks like is it's begun to be established, and that actually is one of the major things that happens with Constantine and the Christianization of Rome is you need an institution, right? It can't just be this grassroots collection of people spreading their message via middle-class women in Greece. We need to make it official, and so things like who gets to be in leadership suddenly takes on new meaning, whereas before, and this is one of the things hopefully we'll talk about as well, is a lot more of a democratic process. Who ended up being in leadership, right? Although there were rules like no women, shockingly, again, what happened to Mary Magdalene for, but yeah, it was a much more democratic process. In fact, our first, replacement is chosen by the flip of a coin. Okay. So secondary sources. So early church fathers, early church leaders that reflect on it. But here's one of the interesting things that we find is over and over again, a lot of them just refer to Josephus. they quote Josephus. So this is the dude that we're gonna talk about quite a bit. What was his time?
Do we need to get a book on him?
No. So I'm going to be using a couple of I don't want Josephus on Jesus. I just want Josephus. Don't autofill for me, Google.
Actually, if you want to read it, I've got 4 volumes of Josephus. If you
4
want to read
volumes?
them,
Yeah.
you can certainly. I'll let you.
I think there's some.
37.
That's probably
37?
Yep, Josephus is born in 37. Common era.
So the bigger you are, the more organized you have to be.
Absolutely. And this is one of the fascinating things as well too. This is we're about to, where modern historians that are trying to figure out things about the past. What is one of the most consistent record keepers of all history? The church. The church. Yeah, in the West, it's the church. That's who you turn to if you want to find out when this person was born or when this person has died, and whether they were a scoundrel or not.
Knowledgeable.
Yeah.
It's been a long
20 years.
It's been a generation.
Yeah, it's 20 to 30 years.
So therefore, he has no personal knowledge.
Nope, not of Jesus.
He's only listening to maybe what is left.
Yep.
And that's it.
Yeah, and here's the thing too is that Josephus is contemporary to Paul, right? Josephus and Paul exist together. So you're right. It's about one generation removed by that point in time.
And Josephus has an employer he needs to satisfy.
Absolutely.
Yes.
He's
Well,
employed.
He's a culture as well.
Yes. Which we'll talk about all this. It's going to be Josephus is he's a conflicted individual. That's for sure. He's a man of mixed loyalties in a lot of ways.
Which is a motivation to write.
Which is a motivation to write. Yeah. Amen.
We better get going.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I can talk about this stuff today.
Yes, we know.
And I will talk about it